This video was brought to you by my loyal patrons. Pledge today and receive exclusive perks. Link in the description. Welcome back to the railway, everyone. In the last installment, I showed you all the biggest changes the layout has seen so far, which included totally changing the track plan. I'm happy to say that I've actually made some significant progress since the last time you saw it, including building stations, detailing track, paving an entire harbor, and adding an entire narrow gauge section. So what are we waiting for? Let's take a look at it all. So let's start this video off by talking about stations. As you all know, there are 2 stations on my railway. Well, 3 technically, we'll get to that. The big terminus station at the end of the line, and this suburban junction station. Let's talk about that one first. On my previous layout, I really loved the idea of having the station raised above the railway, with access to the platforms via a footbridge. It was very suburban, very outskirts of London-esque. I have since changed my mind about this, for I think this being a more traditional countryside station will be a nice visual break from the more brick-heavy big yard. Since that area is coated with retaining walls, I didn't want to add more here. It would have been too samey, I think. Something different would be more visually interesting. So, the station will be at ground level. Before fixing the platforms in place, I checked the track clearance using the widest engine I own, which just so happens to be the Bachmann Bill and Ben. These two have such a large overhang, and I figure if they can clear the platform here, anything will. For the footbridge, I'm using the Hornby Hogsmeade one, which fits in pretty well, I think. The station building itself is Sheffield Park by Bachmann, aka the Bluebell Railway's main station. However, I am not fixing it in place, for I'd like the option to swap buildings around here, to disguise this as a different station for when I eventually start filming. I figure the station setup is generic enough. It can be Sheffield Park on the Bluebell, or it can be Knapford Junction, or something else entirely. That flexibility will come in handy later, I think. The big station has also gained its big canopy, and this has transformed the area immensely. The station feels so much bigger on camera than it actually is with the roofs there. The atmosphere here, Each canopy is made up of 2 Pico overall roof kits. You've probably seen these on other people's layouts. It's a fairly common kit. I've been pretty impressed with Pico's kits so far, but I wasn't a fan of this one. The legs are so fiddly, and I find they get pushed out of place very easily. Perhaps it's the glue I'm using. I'd like to eventually go in and paint the bottom halves of the legs with a brown or a green or something, just to give the station a little more detail. I have the covered footbridge here at the rear of the station, and I purchased a second one that I will use to kit bash the original, so it can finally reach that 3rd platform. While we're here at the station yard, I figure I should probably explain something that I failed to do in the last part. A couple people asked what the point of these sidings are. The long one here is a head shunt, so an engine has some space to move trucks or coaches from a platform to another without entering the main line. It's also just a handy place for storage, perhaps a nice spot for a breakdown train or something. And this little nub here is specifically in case I ever decide to expand the layout through the rear cutoff board there and add a loop behind it to create a full circuit. Now I don't have the space in my garage to do that, so it'll likely never happen. But it's nice to have the option to pull up this set of buffers and add a point to make this whole stretch a through line. Something I have always wanted to do is paint my track. Now, you're probably wondering, what is the point of doing this? Well, it adds another level of realism to a model railway. In real life, rails never stay shiny. They get coated in grime and dirt, and only the tops remain shiny from wheels rolling over them constantly. Model rails are shiny all around, and they look a bit toy-like. Not to mention, the standard 00 track that I'm using has Code 100 rails, which are rather tall. Giving them that little extra bit of definition through painted sides will help hide this. I took some pieces of leftover track and tried out a couple colors. For the first one, I used a darker brown, and on the second, I tried a lighter, more chocolatey brown. The darker brown was too dark, I thought, and was too similar to the sleepers. The warmer brown added a third color to the mix, and contrast the sleepers better. Once I decided on a color, I went to work painting all the tracks on the layout. This was an extremely tedious process, and it took forever. I only realized after I had finished everything that I simply could have just sprayed them all with spray paint and saved a bunch of time, but alas, it's easy to say that in retrospect. If you do want to try your hand at this yourself, do not worry about being messy, because we're going to clean the tops of the rails later. I will say that using a brush was handy for points though. I tried to be careful not to get any paint in areas where the point's rails come in contact with each other, as that would block power from reaching that set of track. I also used this opportunity to paint over all the tops of the unsightly nails used to hold the track in place with black, to blend them in with the sleepers more. Once all the paint was dry, I simply took a track rubber and rubbed away the paint on the rail tops. We only need the top of the rails to make contact with engine's wheels, so that's really the only part of the track that needs to remain clean. And voila! What a difference it makes! That extra color on the rail sides really hides how tall they are, doesn't it? And as you can see, the engines work perfectly on them. I tested out some ballast on this siding to get an idea of how the newly painted track will look once fully covered, and I think it looks pretty good. After this, I chipped away at the rest of the layout, painting the rest of the rails. This was a long, tedious process, and I'm still kicking myself for not just using spray paint in the first place. Ah well, we live and learn. So in part 3, I mentioned how I wanted to add a 009 scale section for narrow gauge on the layout eventually. Well, eventually came sooner than expected. Since I had so much leftover styrofoam from crafting the harbor and the grades from last time, I decided to put it to use. My intention here is to have a big hill in the center of the loop at the cutoff board, with a ruined castle or something like that at the top. And in the middle of it all, a little narrow gauge line surrounding it, popping in and out of tunnels through the cutoff board. Since this is all going to be a big hill I'm going to plaster over later, I didn't really have to be all that precise with how I cut the pieces of styrofoam to shape the hill. I had a general idea of the track plan in my head, and before I glued anything down or cut away at anything, I did a quick test with track to make sure that it'll all fit the way that I wanted to. And what I had fit together pretty well. Didn't have to buy any extra pieces. Now the layout is nothing complex. It's just a little loop so that I have something to run 009 narrow gauge trains on. I decided to add the Bachman's Skarloey station building here to create a little halt for the passengers to disembark and hike up to the ruined castle. And while doing this, I figured I'd add a little more visual interest here with a passing loop, so one train can wait at the halt while another passes by. Before anything could be fixed down and wired up, holes had to be cut into the cutoff board. Using a circular hole saw bit on my drill, I cut out 2 holes in roughly the place the tunnels will be. I got really lucky, as the size of the hole saw that I have was just the right size for 009 engines to pass through. I made sure even my longer engines could clear it, and they had no issue. With holes in the board, now the track could be pinned down. Since I'm not using any flexi track here, I had no issue with just fixing the tracks in place with those pesky track pins that I lamented in the last part. Like the rest of the layout, I also painted the rails of the track, but only on the side of the cutoff board that you would actually see. Even at this small size, that little extra bit of detail makes such a difference. Now, we had an issue. Those holes will have to be covered up with tunnel portals. So my plan originally was to buy the Bachmann Scenecraft 009 tunnel portals. However, they weren't exactly the right style that I wanted. They were a bit too long for the space that I'm working with, and frankly, they're rather overpriced. So I had an idea. What if I just built the portals myself? I decided to try my hand at it. I started with paper, just drawing some portals at first, making sure that the height would be tall enough for engines to clear it. I cut them out, tested them to size, and went from there. Using air-dry clay, I flattened out some on top of the paper cutouts, and then cut out the shapes into the clay with an X-Acto knife. While they were still malleable, I cut little lines into them to create a slate-like sort of texture. Now, I wasn't all that concerned with them being perfectly straight or looking a little wonky, as they're supposed to look hand-built, and their imperfections will be hidden by paint and scenery later on anyway. This worked out way easier than I expected. They look great, and it only took like 10 minutes. I let them dry overnight, and once they were rock solid, tested them out. Perfection. The engines and their trains clear them without issue. I sprayed them with some primer, and then gave them a wash with a slate gray paint. Before the paint dried, I wiped away some of the wet paint, letting that darker color seep into the crevices and create some definition. I messed up a bit by making these portals too thin though, because while wiping away the paint, I managed to snap one in half. Whoops. I glued it back together, painted over it, and no one is none the wiser. Just don't tell anyone, okay? And there we go! 2 perfectly fine tunnel portals for a fraction of the cost of ready-to-run ones. And it's of my own design too, one that matches the aesthetic I wanted. They're just kinda laying against the board at the moment, but once I start shaping hills, I'll fix them into place. But before I start anything with hills, we gotta do something about that eyesore of a cutoff board. Before I put any scenery down, I think it's important to get a backdrop in place first, to not risk reaching over anything. Start at the back and work your way forwards, right? The backdrops I decided to go with were of the same family I used for the previous layout. The Art Printers Village 15-inch back scenes by ID Backscenes. There's 4 of them in total, and when pieced together, they create one long continuous scene. I ordered all of them from Rails of Sheffield, and placed the last one at the end of the cutoff board. I measured and cut holes into it for the tunnels before fixing it into place. Already, this is looking so much better, and it'll look even greater once we have trees and bushes in place to hide some of those seam lines. Making the main board a foot slimmer proved to be a godsend in this instance, as it made hanging all of these backdrops so much easier. Here are all 4 in place, bringing some color and life to that station junction. Now the final one ends in the middle of the big station yard, so I'll have to figure out how I want to continue that eventually. But for now, the layout is looking a lot more colorful. Let's hop down to what was the most time-consuming of this part, the harbor. This area has had some substantial updates since part 3. So my plan was always going to be to pave over the tracks here and have them embedded into the quayside. But before I did that, I needed to figure out what I was going to do for the harbor wall here. My first notion was to simply cover it up with a sort of patterned textured design. Something simple, since I was probably going to cover it up with building facades or something later on. I opted to try this. cobblestone road cloths for Christmas villages. They had a nice cobblestone rock-like texture to them. I thought they were worth trying. After measuring, I cut the cloths to size and glued them in place. And I didn't really love how it looked. I mean, I like the cobblestone texture, but the color is way too dark. It doesn't feel right. It doesn't fit the vibe of what I want here. So I pulled it off and tried something else. I had a bunch of leftover Metcalf stone retaining walls from the previous layout, back when I was debating whether I wanted to use brick or stone. Since I had these on hand, I decided to try them out. And they fit the bill. Their beveled arches add some nice definition to the walls here. A lot more visually interesting than just a flat texture. They were a little too tall for the wall though, so I removed the top part and cut the middle support sections down to match their shorter height. I don't know why I didn't think to just use these before. I love the stone color. It's such a nice contrast from the brick on other parts of the layout. Now that that was sorted, it was time to figure out how to pave this thing. Most of my friends recommended I use an air-dry clay for this. I had some from the tunnel portals that I built before, so I used that. I tested it out with some spare track on a piece of cardboard, and it didn't look too bad. Using an old coach, I ran it through the clay to create flangeways for wheels. When it dried, it looked pretty good, and I was convinced to move forward. I started to pave away at the harbor, one little bit at a time. It was a matter of caking the clay up to match the height of the rails, usually covering them in the process, and then wetting my hands to smooth it over and flatten it all out. It was a process, and it did take a while, but I found it really satisfying. Again, I used a coach to create flangeways for wheels while it was still wet. By the end, it looked really good, and I was happy with it. That is, until the next day. So, I don't know what I did wrong, but once that clay was dry, it cracked badly. I thought I could fill the cracks with more clay, but this didn't seem to fix anything. It just continued to crack more and more. I suspect it had something to do with the clay being placed on styrofoam instead of a solid surface, but I'm not really sure. After trying for several days to make the clay work, I eventually admitted defeat and just pulled it all up. I would have to figure out something else. I decided to try using a type of plaster. I went with Woodland Scenic's Smooth It, a plaster designed for road paving. Just mix with water and plaster away. This was a little harder to put in place since it was more liquidy than the clay, and it was more difficult to get smooth. But once I got the hang of it, it all became a little easier. The stuff dries pretty quick and starts to harden after about 10-15 minutes or so. Right when it was on the cusp of starting to harden, I used that old coach to create flangeways and then let it dry fully. And thankfully, no cracks. The surface ended up being a lot more rough than the clay was, but it didn't crack. Great, I could work with this. I just kept adding on more layers on top of layers until the whole area was pretty even all the way around. Something I had to be extremely particular with were the points. I didn't want to pave over the sections where the tracks move, and even shaped little open areas around where the bars are. I don't really like this area just being open like this, so I might cover it up with card or something later on. Once I was happy with how even the plaster looked, I let it completely dry, and then sanded the hell out of it with a power sander. And this actually worked really well. The final result was really smooth, pretty much all around. Then using a track rubber, I uncovered all the rails, and then did a couple tests with various engines to make sure everything cleared without issue. We're in a good spot now. Time for paint. I started painting it all with a brush in a slate gray color. Just like with painting the rails earlier, I did not care if I got paint on the rail tops, because I could just clean those off with a rubber later. And the slate gray was too dark for my liking. The key being darker than the retaining walls looked kind of weird. They didn't really blend. So I did what I should have done in the first place and just sprayed the whole thing with a lighter gray primer. Oh my god, that looks so much better. Wow, that turned out well. I cleaned the tracks off again with a rubber and did another engine test. Excellent. We now have a working harbor. Just need some details to really start looking the part. At some point, I'll get a dockside crane in here, some dock stanchions, and I'll eventually add water and boats. But at the moment, I am so happy with how this came together. It took way longer than anticipated, a lot of trial and error here, but it was worth it. There is something so satisfying about embedded rails, and I am really happy to have a section with them on the layout. Now, we didn't do a running session last time, but now that everything is up and running again, let's see some trains do their thing. I want to take a moment to give a shout out to someone here. Alex, aka Oregon Western Railroad Productions. I drove down to a model shop in Portland a while back to buy materials, and he was there and recognized me. He actually gave me a boxcar, this Seattle and North Coast one from Atlas. That was just so nice of him. So let's get some shots of it running. Thanks again for this, Alex. That was so kind of you. His YouTube channel is linked below. Go check his stuff out. Now that the majority of the harbor is done and the area for the narrow gauge is all in place, I have now started to shape hills using chicken wire here, though I haven't gotten that far. I haven't been able to work on it in the last few weeks for one reason. This little guy. Yeah, we got a puppy recently. His name is Mosby. And when you have a puppy, you gotta watch it constantly while it's still being trained. Haven't had much time to spend out in the garage working on trains. Anyways, hopefully, I'll have actual hills shaped and plastered for part 5. That's my goal anyway. I personally can't wait for that, because I think that's when a model railway really starts to take shape. For this pick of the week, I'd like to shout out the Thomas Theorist with his video, 127 Things You Missed in the Great Race. This is a pretty lengthy video pointing out details and plot revelations within the 2016 movie, The Great Race. As someone who is not the biggest fan of this movie, I found this video really interesting, and found some new things to like about it. This is probably my favorite video from Adam so far, and I look forward to his next one on Journey Beyond Sodor, which may or may not be out by the time that this video is uploaded. Check it out! I hope everyone who went to the Audrey extravaganza this year had a great time. From what I saw on social media, this seemed like the year to go. The new faces for Sir Handel and Rusty look great. Midlander looks so smart in black. A lot of information regarding the main characters' proposed prototypes was revealed too. Lots to dive into there. I'd love to make a video covering some of that in the future. Major props to the Taliclin team. Seems like they put on an awesome event. And that is all from me today, folks. Hope you all have a great day, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye-bye.